He signed the papers on a silver tray, not across a desk in some lawyer's office, not in private, where the ugly business of ending a marriage could at least wear the costume of dignity. Grayson Hale signed the divorce papers on a silver serving tray held by a catering waiter in front of 300 people in the middle of his own charity gala, with the Miami harbor glittering behind the floor-to-ceiling glass like it was applauding him. He handed the pen back to the waiter without looking at his wife. "You'll want to sign those too," he said. Loud enough. Loud enough that the string quartet faltered for just a moment, the violinist losing her place, the music stuttering before finding its footing again. "Unless you need someone to explain what they mean." The room didn't go quiet. It went careful. There's a difference. Quiet is the absence of sound. Careful is 300 wealthy people choosing very deliberately not to look at the woman standing beside the man who just humiliated her, because looking would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would mean having to feel something about it, and feeling something about it might cost them an invitation next year. Alara Vaughn picked up the pen. She didn't shake. She didn't look around the room to see who was watching. She read the page, actually read it, slowly, the way a person reads something that matters. And then she signed her name in the same careful, unhurried handwriting she used for everything. Birthday cards. Grocery lists. The mortgage on the first house they'd shared, 11 years ago, when Grayson still drove a leased sedan and called her every afternoon just to hear her voice. She set the pen back on the tray. "Thank you," she said to the waiter. Not to Grayson. To the waiter. Then she turned and walked toward the far side of the room, toward the glass doors that opened onto the harbor terrace, and the crowd parted for her, not because she commanded it, but because there was something in the way she moved, unhurried, shoulders back, chin level, that made stepping aside feel like the only reasonable thing to do. Grayson watched her go. Then he reached for a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray and turned back to the investors he'd been cultivating all evening, and the smile on his face didn't even have to work very hard to return. "Now," he said. Where were we? That was the night everything Grayson Hale had built began to come apart. He didn't know it yet. That's the thing about men like Grayson. The collapse is always already in motion long before they can feel the ground shifting. He would spend the next weeks replaying that moment, trying to locate the exact second when he lost control of the situation. And he would keep arriving at the wrong answer because the wrong answer was the only one his particular brand of pride would allow him to reach. He would decide it was the weather. He would decide it was the timing. He would decide it was the waiter's expression, or the way the string quartet stumbled, or the fact that his attorney had advised against a public signing. But Grayson had overruled him because Grayson always overruled everyone. He would not decide that it was Alara. He had made that particular mistake before, and old habits in men like Grayson run very, very deep. The terrace was cold for Miami in October. A front had come in off the Atlantic sometime in the last hour, and the air had that particular salt and metal smell that means serious weather is on its way. The harbor lights shimmered in choppy water. Somewhere in the dark, a buoy bell clanked its slow, indifferent rhythm. Alara stood at the railing with her arms folded across her chest, not hugging herself, not seeking comfort, just keeping the wind from getting inside the fabric of her dress, and looked out at the water. The dress was ice blue. It had cost more than the first car she'd ever driven. Grayson had picked it. Grayson picked most things, in the years since the money had come. He had very specific ideas about how she should appear. She was 34 years old, and she had been married to Grayson Hale for 8 of those years, and she had spent most of them learning to make herself smaller. Not through any single dramatic act of submission, but through the slow, daily accumulation of small surrenders. The opinions she stopped offering because they made him tired. The friends she stopped calling because he found them irritating. The versions of herself she'd quietly folded up and stored somewhere deep and still and waiting. She wasn't crying. She'd checked for that as soon as the terrace door closed behind her. She'd expected tears and found only a kind of vast, windswept calm. The way the sky looks after a storm has stripped everything loose from it. The rain started. Not gently. Miami rain doesn't negotiate. It arrived all at once, hard and immediate, hammering the deck, and Alara tilted her face up toward it for just a moment, one full breath, before lowering her chin again and watching the harbor. That was when the lights appeared, far out, past the marina's breakwater. Moving lights, and too many of them, coming in fast from the open water. She watched them without knowing yet what she was watching. Waterspouts sometimes lit up the horizon this time of year. Cargo ships ran late schedules through the channel. Her mind offered these reasonable explanations, and she accepted them for almost 40 seconds before the sound reached her. Rotors. Not one helicopter, 3 at least, and flying low. And beneath the chop of the rotors, another sound, deep, structural, the kind of vibration you feel in your sternum before you register it with your ears, the displacement of an enormous vessel moving at speed through sheltered water. The thing that came around the breakwater was not a cargo ship. It was black from waterline to radar mast. No commercial markings. Running lights, minimal and amber. It moved with the unhurried certainty of something that had never in its existence been required to yield to anything, and its wake hit the smaller marina craft like a slow-motion slap, sending dinghies and day sailors rocking against their slips with a sound like scattered applause. Armed patrol boats flanked it on both sides, maintaining perfect formation. The helicopters held position overhead. Alara gripped the railing. Inside the glass behind her, she could see the party still going. The gesturing hands, the tilted champagne flutes, the bright theater of wealth reassuring itself. Nobody in there had noticed yet. Nobody in there was looking at the water. The superyacht slowed further, settled into position opposite the gala venue's private dock with a precision that suggested whoever was handling navigation had done this particular maneuver in this particular harbor before. The gangway extended. The men who came ashore were dressed in black suits that fit too well to have been bought off any rack, and they moved with the coordinated economy of people who had trained for this kind of entrance. Not running, not hurrying, moving with a deliberateness that was somehow more alarming than any rush could have been. The lead man was broad across the shoulders, gray at the temples, a face that had been handsome once and was now something more durable than handsome. He carried no visible weapon. He didn't need to. The 8 men fanned behind him carried enough for everyone. He stopped at the foot of the dock. He looked at the terrace, at the woman standing in the rain at the railing, ice blue dress soaked through now, dark hair plastered to her neck and shoulders, watching him with an expression he recognized. He had been waiting 11 years to see that face again. He crossed the distance between them in long, unhurried strides, climbed the terrace steps, and stopped 2 feet from her. Rain poured over both of them. He looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at something you thought might be lost forever. And then, without a word, he went down on one knee on the wet deck. His men did the same, all 8 of them, without hesitation, without signal. "Miss Vaughn!" His voice was accented, faintly, the ghost of somewhere European ground into something more contained over years of deliberate practice. "The boss has come to bring you home." Behind the glass, Grayson Hale had finally turned to look. He saw his freshly divorced wife standing in the rain on the terrace with 8 armed men kneeling in front of her, and the laugh that came out of him was short and reflexive and loud enough that the couple nearest to him turned to see what was funny. Then he looked at the faces of the other guests. The CEO of Harwell Shipping had gone the color of old chalk. The Brazilian port administrator he'd been courting for 6 months was already moving toward the exit, phone pressed to his ear, voice too low to hear. 3 of the most prominent real estate developers in the southern United States were standing absolutely still in the way that people stand still when they have realized, all at once, that they are in a room where something is happening that is very far above their weight class. Grayson's smile lasted another 2 seconds. Then it didn't. The inside of the gala shattered into noise. Not panic, not yet, but the particular noise of 300 people all deciding simultaneously to have urgent conversations in lowered voices. Security staff materialized from the walls. Grayson found his personal head of security, a former FBI man named Kettrick, at his shoulder within seconds. "What the hell is that ship?" Grayson said. "Working on it." Kettrick had his phone out, thumb moving. "The patrol boats. Those are not Coast Guard. Flags are Maltese registry, but the vessel configuration is—" He stopped. His thumb stopped moving. "Kettrick." "Sir." Kettrick looked up from the phone, and he had 11 years of federal law enforcement behind him, and even so his face had done something unfamiliar. "Sir, you need to listen to me very carefully." "I'm listening." "Whatever you said to your wife tonight." Kettrick glanced at the terrace, at Alara, still standing in the rain, looking down at the kneeling men with an expression that was not fear and not surprise and not the blank pleasantness she'd worn all evening inside. Whatever you said or did, do not compound it. She's my ex-wife as of 20 minutes ago, and that's my... The ship, Kettrick said quietly, is the Anima Nera. It is registered to a holdings company that exists in 4 jurisdictions and belongs to none of them. Every intelligence agency in the Western world has a file on it. I have personally seen pieces of 2 of those files. He paused. The man kneeling on your terrace is Dante Moretti. The name did not immediately mean anything to Grayson, which meant Grayson had been living, without knowing it, in a version of the world that was much smaller than the actual one. He runs, Kettrick started. I know who the Morettis are, Grayson said. He said it the way men say things they have just looked up inside themselves and found to be only barely true. Crime family, European, shipping. Among other things. Kettrick put his phone away. Among very many other things. He looked at Alara again. How long were you married to her? 8 years? And before that? Grayson opened his mouth and closed it. He had met Alara Vaughn at a mutual friend's dinner party. She'd been 26. She worked for an architectural preservation nonprofit. She had student debt and a studio apartment in Coral Gables. And she laughed too loudly at things that weren't that funny, and she'd been the most purely uncalculating person he had encountered in years of moving through rooms full of people who calculated everything. He had liked that about her in the beginning. Later, he had decided it was a limitation. She had a life before me, he said. Obviously. Did you ever look into it? Silence. Did you run a background check? She was a nonprofit grant writer, Kettrick. I didn't run a... He stopped. He looked at the terrace, at the kneeling men, at the massive black ship in his harbor. No. Kettrick's expression didn't change. That was somehow worse than if it had. On the terrace, Alara had not moved. The man she knew was named Marco, though that wasn't the name he'd been born with, and the name she'd been born with wasn't Vaughn, and the life she'd spent 11 years believing she'd left behind was apparently not the kind of life you leave. So Marco was still kneeling. He had knelt in the rain for 4 full minutes, and he would kneel for another 4 if she required it. She knew that about him. She knew it the way she knew certain other things that she'd spent a very long time not examining too closely. The tactical geometry of a room, the weight of a person's stillness versus their restlessness, the specific quality of silence that means someone nearby is about to move. Stand up, she said. Marco, stand up. You're getting your suit wet. He rose. His men rose with him. She saw the fractional loosening of his shoulders as she used his name. How did you find me? She said. We always knew where you were. Then why? Because you were safe. He said it simply. And then 6 weeks ago, the situation changed. What changed? He looked past her, through the glass, into the party. Not at Grayson. At something she couldn't immediately locate. Then she traced his gaze and found it. A man she didn't recognize, standing near the bar, in a suit that fit differently from the other suits in the room. He was watching them through the glass with no pretense of doing anything else. Who is that? She said. Someone who has been watching you for the last 3 months. Marco's voice remained level. Someone the Volkov organization sent. The name landed in her chest like a dropped stone hitting still water. She had not heard that name in 11 years. She had worked very deliberately to never hear it again. Alara. Marco's voice was careful now. Careful in the specific way of someone delivering news they have been rehearsing. Your brother needs you. She turned and looked at him. Dante, she said. It was not a question. She had not said the name aloud in 11 years, and it felt strange in her mouth, the wrong size for the space she'd been giving it. He's here. He's been waiting on the boat. Marco glanced at the superyacht. He wanted me to come first. He wasn't sure. A pause. I wasn't sure how you'd receive him. 11 years, a city in the rain, a divorce signed on a silver tray by a man who had spent 8 years deciding she wasn't worth the space she occupied. And on a black ship in the harbor, a brother she hadn't seen since she was 3 years old was waiting to see if she'd come home. Alara looked back through the glass one more time. Grayson was watching her. He'd found a place near the center of the room where he could watch without appearing to watch. And his face was doing the thing it did when he encountered a situation his models couldn't account for, the jaw tight, the eyes slightly too still, the calculation running visibly behind the expression. She thought about the pen in her hand 20 minutes ago. The way she'd read the divorce papers slowly, not because she needed to understand them, but because she'd needed one full minute of not being told what to do, of having something in front of her that required only her own attention and judgment before the door of this particular chapter closed. She turned back to Marco. "Let me get my coat," she said. He shook his head. "We have coats on the boat." She almost smiled. "Of course you do." She walked to the terrace steps, walked down to the dock. The rain was still coming hard, and the harbor water was black and restless beneath the yacht's running lights, and she moved through it without hurrying, without looking back, with the same steadiness she'd carried across the gala floor 20 minutes ago. The crowd on the terrace above, the ones who'd drifted out to see what was happening, watched her go. They would remember this for the rest of their lives. The woman in the soaked blue dress, walking down the dock through the rain toward the enormous black ship, 8 armed men opening a path for her, the helicopters holding position above like they were waiting for her specifically. Most of them had looked at Alara Vaughn for years and seen a pleasant, quiet woman who smiled at the right moments and didn't ask for much. None of them had been looking correctly. On the dock, just before the gangway, she stopped. Not because she was afraid, not because she was uncertain, because for just a moment she needed to feel the rain and the salt air and the solidity of the boards beneath her feet, this exact physical present, before stepping across the threshold into whatever the next version of her life was going to require. She breathed in, she breathed out. Then she walked up the gangway, and the night swallowed her whole. Inside the gala, Grayson Hale stood at the window and watched the gangway retract. The superyacht's running lights shifted. The engines, impossibly quiet for something that size, changed their note by a fraction of a tone, and the great black hull began to move. The patrol boats fell into formation. The helicopters banked east. Within 4 minutes, the ship was past the breakwater. Within 6, it was dark water. Kettrick was beside him. Sir, we need to talk about your financial holdings." "Not now." "Sir, we need to talk about them right now." Kettrick lowered his voice to a register that meant this was the kind of conversation that required a room with a closed door. "Specifically about the origins of the Hale Group's initial capitalization. Specifically about your father's business relationships in the early 90s. He paused. "Specifically about a name that keeps appearing in those records." Grayson turned from the window. "What name?" he said. Kettrick looked at the dark water where the ship had been. "Volkov," he said. The champagne glass in Grayson's hand was suddenly very heavy. The string quartet had started up again in the far room, something slow and graceful, and completely at odds with the fact that Grayson Hale was standing at the window of his own charity gala, discovering in real time that the ground he'd built everything on had never, in any meaningful sense, been his. He had thrown away the most valuable thing in the room. He just didn't know yet exactly how many different ways that was true. The cabin they gave her was larger than the first apartment she'd ever rented. She stood in the middle of it and dripped on the floor and didn't move for almost a full minute, taking inventory the way she'd always taken inventory of unfamiliar spaces, exits, sight lines, the weight of the door, the placement of windows relative to the waterline. Old habits. She hadn't known, until this moment, how old they actually were. Someone had left dry clothes on the bed. Dark trousers, a cream-colored sweater, wool socks. No note. The clothes fit. Of course they did. She changed without turning on the main lights. The porthole gave her enough, harbor amber fading as the yacht moved out, replaced by the open Atlantic's particular darkness, which was not absence of light so much as light held at a great distance. She wrung the rain from her hair over the small bathroom sink, watching the water run clear, and looked at her own face in the mirror for longer than she meant to. 34 years old. The same eyes her mother had, according to the one photograph she'd been allowed to keep, back when she was still young enough that keeping it felt like holding something rather than mourning it. The same jaw. The same way of going very still when something frightening was happening nearby, which her foster mother in Coral Gables had called composure, and which Alara had eventually understood was something else entirely. She heard the knock and said, "Come in," before she'd consciously decided to. He was taller than she'd expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Some internal picture assembled from fragments, from secondhand descriptions, From the single memory she wasn't sure was real, a boy's hand, larger than hers, in a dark room, holding on. Dante Moretti was 41 years old, broad through the chest, dark-haired with the first gray arriving at his temples in the same pattern their father had apparently worn it. She knew that from photographs. She'd looked over the years. She'd looked and then put the looking away in the same drawer where she kept everything else she wasn't supposed to have. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her the way Marco had looked at her on the dock. That same quality of recognition mixed with something rawer, something that hadn't had time to arrange itself into composure. "You're taller than I thought," he said. "You're grayer," she said. A beat. Then something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. He stepped into the cabin and left the door open, which she noticed and appreciated. The open door was a choice, a signal. We are not having the kind of conversation that requires a closed room. "Sit down," she said. "You're making the ceiling look low." He sat in the chair by the porthole. She sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on her knees, and they looked at each other across maybe 6 feet of cabin floor with 11 years of silence between them. "How much do you know?" he said. "About myself or about you?" "Start wherever you want. I know your name, I know your organization. I know enough about the Moretti Syndicate to understand why I was hidden, and not enough about anything else to understand why I was left there for 11 years. She held his gaze. "So start there." He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet, thinking quiet. The kind that meant he was choosing precision over speed. "When our father was killed," he said, "I was 17. You were 3. The people who came for him came for the whole family. We lost 6 people that night. 2 of them were in the room with you." He paused. "Marco got you out. There was a plan. There's always a plan when you live the way our father lived. But the plan was for a different scenario. The plan was for both children to go together. What happened instead was Marco got you through the East Corridor and lost contact with everyone else, and he made a decision. He ran with me. He ran with you. He got you to Miami because Miami was the contingency city and he knew people there. He set up the Vaughn identity, placed you with a family, and spent the next 3 years making sure anyone looking would find nothing." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "You have to understand what we didn't know for almost 2 years that you were alive. Marco went dark to protect you. By the time he made contact, I was in the middle of the worst period the Moretti organization had ever survived, and the only way you stayed safe was if you stayed unknown. So you left me there." "Yes." The word landed clean. No cushioning, no qualification. She gave him points for that. "You left me there," she said again, "for 11 years. I monitored you, every year, every address, every school, every— That's not the same thing." "No." His jaw tightened. "It isn't." She stood up. Not from agitation, she needed to move, needed the physical action of movement to process what was happening in her chest, which was not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but something composite and unwieldy that she didn't have vocabulary for yet. She went to the porthole and looked at the black water. "The Volkov family," she said. "Yes. They killed our father. With help from inside, we never identified everyone involved." A pause. "Until recently." She turned. "What happened recently?" "Someone talked." His voice dropped a register. "One of the men who survived that night. He's old now, and sick, and apparently decided he'd rather die clean than die carrying it. He gave us a name." "Whose name?" Dante stood. He was across the cabin in 3 steps, and he lowered his voice even though they were alone and at sea, which told her the name was the kind that required that precaution even in empty rooms. "Cabretti," he said. "Luca Cabretti." She didn't know the name, but she watched his face when he said it, and she saw what it cost him, and she understood it was someone close. "He's yours," she said. "He's one of yours." "He's been my second in command for 6 years." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and texture. Outside, the engines changed tone again, deeper, settling into open water cruise, and the yacht steadied beneath them. "He doesn't know you know," she said. "No. And he doesn't know I'm here." "He will. I can't keep this quiet for long. Too many people on board, too many who'll talk." Dante moved to the porthole beside her, looking out at nothing. "When he finds out, he'll move. And when he moves, The Volkov connection goes active. How long do we have? Hours, maybe. Not days. Alara looked at her own hands. They were steady. She noticed that, as information, the way she'd been noticing things as information all evening, cataloging, assessing, building a picture of the situation the way you build a picture of an unfamiliar room in the dark. You said you needed me, she said. Marco said you needed me. I'm here. What does that actually mean? What is it you think I can do? Dante looked at her. The Moretti succession has specific requirements. Our grandfather established them. Blood recognition, formal ceremony, witnessed by the council. He paused. Without you, the succession line is contested. I have no heir. 3 of my captains are circling that fact already. The Volkov family knows it, which is why they sent someone to watch you. If they can reach you before the recognition ceremony, the Moretti leadership fractures. Another pause. With you recognized, the line is secure. The Volkov leverage disappears. And Cabretti loses his argument. His whole position is that the syndicate needs to consolidate under a single authority. If you're recognized, there's nothing to consolidate. She walked to the door, looked at the corridor, clean, quiet, dim, 2 men stationed at the far end, not looking at her but positioned so they'd see everything. She looked back at Dante. I need to know who's loyal, she said. Not who you trust, who's loyal. There's a difference. Something shifted in his face. Recognition, maybe. The same recognition Marco had shown on the dock, but deeper. Marco, he said. 4 others. I'll give you names. Tonight. Tonight. She nodded once. Then let's start. 3 decks up, in the ship's communications center, a man named Cabretti was already starting. Luca Cabretti was 53 years old, built like someone who had once been very strong and had stayed strong by the particular discipline of not allowing himself to become anything else. His hair was silver and cut close. His face assembled from a series of decisions, the way faces are, after a certain age, the map of everything you've chosen and everything that's been done to you. He sat in front of a dark screen with a phone pressed to his ear and listened without speaking for almost 90 seconds. She's here, he said. A pause. The voice on the other end. Yes. On board. Another pause. I know that's not... He stopped. Listen to me. She's been outside for 11 years. She doesn't know the council. She doesn't know the protocols. Whatever Dante thinks he's going to accomplish with this recognition ceremony... He stopped again, listening. His jaw worked. That is a very large ask. The voice said something. Cabretti's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went quiet in the way things go quiet when a decision is being made. How long? He said. Another pause. Miami? He looked at the dark screen. On it, a map of the eastern seaboard. That's too close. The voice said something else. Fine, Cabretti said. Fine. But if Dante moves the ceremony up... He stopped. I know. I'll handle it. He ended the call and sat for a moment in the blue light of the screens, completely motionless. Then he stood, smoothed his jacket, and walked out of the communications center with the measured, unhurried step of a man who has decided exactly how the next 12 hours are going to go. Grayson Hale did not go home. He sat in the back of his car in the Gala's parking structure for 22 minutes, while Kettrick drove in widening circles through downtown Miami, checking for tails, and used that time to make 7 phone calls. 3 of them went unanswered. 2 of the people who answered hung up within 60 seconds, which told Grayson something about the quality of his alliances now that the evening's events were presumably spreading through the financial networks. The 7th call picked up on the 4th ring. It's late, said the man on the other end. His name was Florian, and he was the kind of lawyer who didn't appear in public directories. And you sound like someone who just touched an electric fence. I need records, Grayson said. My father's. Original capitalization documents for the Hale Group, 1988 to 1994. A pause. Those records are archived. Then unarchive them. Grayson. Florian's voice was careful. Why? Because I need to know something. What you're describing, if those records show what I think they might show, you understand that knowing is not a neutral act. Knowing creates a legal posture. Knowing creates Florian. Grayson's voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. He steadied it. Someone told me tonight that my father had a relationship with the Volkov family in the early 90s. I need to know if that's true. Silence on the other end, longer than was comfortable. I'll call you back, Florian said, and was gone. Grayson put the phone on the seat and looked out the window at the parking structure's concrete pillars, each one lit by a sodium lamp that made everything it touched look slightly ill. Kettrick was navigating the exit ramp, glancing in the rear view with the professional frequency of someone trained to watch without appearing to. Where to? Kettrick said. Office, Grayson said. Then, no, not the office. He thought. Take me to the storage facility in Doral. The personal unit? The one my father set up, the one I never emptied. Kettrick absorbed this without comment, which was one of the things Grayson paid him for, and turned south on the expressway. Grayson looked at his reflection in the rain-streaked window. He tried to locate some version of the evening that made sense, tried to find the angle from which tonight was just an embarrassing incident, a strange disruption, something that could be contained and managed and absorbed into the narrative of Grayson Hale as a man in control of his circumstances. He couldn't find it. The thing that kept coming back to him, the image he couldn't argue himself out of, was Alara's face when she looked at the kneeling men. Not surprise. Not fear. Not the blank pleasantness she wore like armor at every gala and dinner and investor presentation where he'd decided her presence added the right note of approachable humanity to his brand. She had looked at those men with the expression of someone receiving news they had been waiting for, like someone who had known, somewhere in themselves, that this moment was always coming. On the Anima Nera, 4 hours out of Miami, Elara was in the ship's library. It wasn't a library in any conventional sense. A narrow room lined with built-in shelves, navigational charts alongside history, some fiction, a lot of philosophy, the particular collection of a person who reads seriously and without any program except their own curiosity. She'd found it at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, following a corridor she hadn't been shown, guided by some spatial instinct that told her this ship had been arranged by someone who thought about space the way she thought about space. She was reading a file. Marco had brought her 4 of them. Slim folders, physical paper, which told her Dante kept his most sensitive material off any network. Names, histories, loyalty assessments, written in a terse shorthand she'd needed 10 minutes to parse. She read them the way she read everything important, front to back once, fast, to get the shape of it, then back to the beginning slowly, building a 3-dimensional picture. Marco sat across from her with coffee he'd brought from the galley, watching her read without speaking, which she appreciated. Cabretti's file isn't here, she said. Dante keeps that one himself. I need to see it. I know. I'll work on that. She turned a page. How long has Dante known about Cabretti? 6 weeks, since the informant talked. And in 6 weeks he hasn't moved against him. The council, Marco said. Cabretti has relationships with 4 council members. Moving against him without evidence that survives a council review risks a fracture. He drank his coffee. And Dante needed you here first. He needed the succession line closed before anything else moves. He needed me as a political tool, she said, not bitterly, as a fact. He needed you alive, Marco said, first and above everything else. What comes after that is strategy. She looked up from the file. You've been protecting me for 11 years. Yes. You watched me marry Grayson Hale. Something flickered across Marco's face. We had concerns, but you didn't intervene. You were safe. You were living a life. It wasn't... He stopped, set the coffee down with great deliberateness. It was not my place to make your choices for you, even the ones that were mistakes, she said. I was going to say difficult. They were mistakes. She said it evenly. He was a mistake I made because I was lonely and I thought ordinary was safe, and I had spent so long pretending to be someone else that I forgot to figure out who I actually was. She went back to the file. I'm not interested in being protected from my own decisions, Marco, retrospectively or otherwise. He looked at her for a long moment. Your father said something like that, he said, almost word for word. She didn't answer, but her hand on the page stilled for a moment, and she allowed herself that, just a moment of not being composed about it, before she turned the page and kept reading. At 4 in the morning, It was a different junior communications officer who noticed the anomaly. He was 23 years old and 6 months into his posting, and he was very nearly asleep at his station when the signal pattern on the passive monitoring screen changed in a way the training had told him to flag immediately. He flagged it. He called his supervisor. His supervisor looked at the screen and went very still and picked up the internal phone. "Get Mr. Moretti," the supervisor said. "Now." 4 minutes later, Dante was in the communications center in a shirt he'd thrown on over sweatpants, his hair doing what hair does at 4 in the morning, and he was looking at the screen with the expression of someone whose worst expectation has just been confirmed. "How many?" he said. "2 signatures. Maybe 3. It's hard to isolate." "Distance." 40 nautical miles, closing. They're running dark." Dante stared at the screen. 40 miles. At speed. Depending on what kind of vessels, depending on how they were pushing. 40 minutes, maybe less. "Wake everyone, listen," he said. Full station." "Mr. Cabretti." "Wake everyone," Dante said again. "In that order." He turned and walked out of the communications center at a controlled pace that was not quite a run and not quite a walk, and was recognizable, to anyone who'd served in a field operation, as the pace of someone running the math while their body carries them to where they need to be. He stopped outside Alara's cabin. Knocked. The door opened in under 3 seconds, which told him she'd been awake. She was dressed. File in hand, alert, looking at him with that particular quality of stillness he was beginning to understand was not detachment, but concentration. "We have company," he said. "Volkov?" "Almost certainly." "How long?" "Maybe 40 minutes. She nodded. "Show me the ship's schematics." He blinked. "What?" "The layout. Deck plans. Where we're exposed, where we're not. Show me." She stepped into the corridor. "And get me Cabretti's file. Whatever version you have, whatever's in it, I need it now." He looked at her. This woman who had been standing in the rain on a gala terrace 5 hours ago with a freshly signed divorce and nothing but the clothes on her back. And he made a decision about her that he knew, as he made it, was the kind of decision that couldn't be unmade. "This way," he said. Luca Cabretti was already dressed. He'd been dressed for an hour. Suit pressed, shoes polished, the same meticulous preparation he brought to every significant morning. He sat in his cabin with his phone in his hand and read the alert that came through at 4:17 with an expression of mild professional interest, as though someone had sent him a scheduling update. He typed a reply. Short. 3 words. Ahead of schedule. Then he pocketed the phone, stood, and smoothed his jacket, and went to find out exactly how Dante intended to handle the next 40 minutes. The deck briefing happened in the main operations room, and it was fast, and it was ugly. 8 men around a table, Dante at the head, Marco at his right, Cabretti 3 seats down with that polished attentiveness that Alara, standing to one side, slightly back, watching, recognized immediately for what it was. She'd seen that face across boardroom tables, the face of someone who already knows the outcome and is performing investment in the process. She said nothing. She watched. Dante laid out the contact pattern. 2 vessels, possibly 3, closing from the southwest. Engagement options: run, evade, or hold position and receive. Running gave them time, but put them in open water with unknown pursuers and a limited defensive posture. Holding was a gamble on who arrived first, their own backup or whoever was closing from the southwest. "We should run," Cabretti said. His voice was calm, authoritative, the voice of someone who has run operations for 20 years and knows how to sound like the most experienced person in the room. "Push north, Bahamas territorial waters within 90 minutes at full speed, complicates any aggressive action." 3 of the other men nodded. Marco looked at the table. Alara looked at Cabretti. He felt her looking. He turned, and for a fraction of a second, something passed between them. Not recognition, not familiarity. Something more uncomfortable than either. The specific awareness of 2 people who understand each other's function in a room, even without introduction. "What are the contact vessel's speed signatures?" she said. Everyone looked at her. Cabretti's eyes narrowed fractionally. "Based on the closing rate," she continued, speaking to the communications officer, not to Cabretti. "What's the estimate?" The officer checked his tablet. 40 plus knots, both of them. Fast interceptors, she said, which means running north doesn't gain us anything. They match our speed and they have more range in that configuration. She looked at the chart on the table. What's our depth here? 200 meters, give or take. She traced a line on the chart with one finger. This channel, between these two shoal formations. They can't follow us through there at that speed. The draft's too shallow. We don't run north. We run shallow, and we make them choose between speed and safety. The room was quiet for a beat. She's right, Marco said. Cabretti's jaw moved. She's been on this ship for 5 hours. She's right, Marco said again, simply, and looked at Dante. Dante looked at Alara. She was still looking at the chart, finger still on the channel route, and she wasn't performing confidence. She was just right, and she knew she was right, and she was waiting for someone to authorize the right answer so they could stop losing time. Navigation, Dante said. The channel approach she's describing. How fast can we plot it? 8 minutes. Plot it. Cabretti leaned back in his chair. His expression was neutral, professional, arranged. His phone was in his jacket pocket, and it had not vibrated, and it would not vibrate, because the people sending the 2 fast interceptors from the southwest were the same people who had just received his 3-word reply, and they were professionals, and they did not make mistakes like sending notifications when a signal had already been received. He looked at Alara one more time. She was already looking somewhere else, already thinking 3 steps ahead, already building the next picture, and she did not look back at him. Cabretti understood, in that moment, with the cold clarity that comes from decades of reading rooms correctly, that the woman Dante had brought aboard was not what he had expected. He'd expected a civilian, a symbol, a bloodline, and a blue dress. What he was looking at was something that had been sleeping for 11 years and was now very much awake. He picked up his coffee and drank it and did not let his face change. But he moved the timeline up in his head by 6 hours, and he sent the message from a secondary phone he kept in the breast pocket of his jacket, against his sternum where his heart was, and the message said one word: tonight. The channel run took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of the Anima Nera pushing through water so shallow the sonar was reading bottom formations in real time. The navigation officer calling out depth margins in a voice kept deliberately flat. The numbers close enough that 2 of the younger crew members were gripping their stations with both hands and not pretending otherwise. Alara stood at the starboard observation window and watched the darkness and counted her own heartbeats, which was a technique she had developed at some point in her life without knowing she was developing it, without knowing why she'd need it. The way you develop a lot of things when your body understands something your conscious mind hasn't been told yet. The interceptors didn't follow. One of them tried, pushed to the channel entrance, got a depth reading, pulled back hard enough that its wake was visible on radar as a curving retreat. The other held position outside the shoals, circling slow, and then both signatures began moving south. "They're withdrawing," the navigation officer said. Nobody cheered. The room let out a collective breath that wasn't celebration. It was the sound of people who understood they had bought time, not safety. Time and safety were different currencies on a ship with a traitor on board. Dante stood at the chart table and looked at the plot they'd just run and didn't say anything for almost 30 seconds. "Good call," he said finally. He wasn't looking at Cabretti when he said it. Cabretti's response was immediate and smooth. Unconventional, but it worked. He glanced at Alara with the expression of a man crediting an unexpected asset, quick thinking under pressure. Alara looked at him directly. "Thank you, Luca." The use of his first name was deliberate. She watched him register it, the fractional adjustment, the recalibration, the decision about whether she'd used it as familiarity or as something else. She watched him decide on familiarity because that was the more comfortable answer, and comfortable answers are what people choose when they're managing appearances. She'd used it to watch his eyes. She'd seen what she needed. Dante pulled her into the corridor outside the operations room while the crew dispersed to station. "You need to tell me what you saw in there," he said quietly. "Not a request. Give me his file first." "Alara, the file. Then I'll tell you what I saw." He looked at her for a beat. Then he went to the safe in his own cabin. She waited outside, which was its own kind of message. "I'm not asking to see everything, just this," and came back with a folder thicker than the others, worn at the edges. The kind of folder that had been opened and closed many times over many years. She took it. stood in the corridor under the dim running lights, and read the first 3 pages while he watched her. She stopped on page 4. "This name," she said. She pointed without handing him the page, keeping the document oriented toward herself. "Renata Cabretti." "His mother." "Deceased." "Yes." "He was raised—" Dante stopped. Something shifted in his face. "He was raised by our father. After his mother died, he grew up in the Moretti household." A pause, and in that pause she could see him arriving somewhere he hadn't fully visited before. "He grew up alongside me." "He's your half-brother, she said. The corridor was very quiet. "His mother and your father," she said, keeping her voice even, keeping the clinical distance of someone stating facts rather than detonating them. "The dates match. The timing of when your father brought him into the household, the age gap, the way the file describes his status as, it says ward here, but the financial arrangements described in the footnotes are inheritance track, not employment. He was positioned as—" "Stop," Dante said. She stopped. He put one hand flat against the corridor wall, not for support, for something to press against, something solid and external to push the knowledge into. His jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle working. He breathed through his nose twice, and the second breath was steadier than the first. And when he looked up again, his eyes were the eyes of a man who has just had the architecture of his life redrawn without his consent. "He knows," Dante said. "He's always known," she said. "That's the point. He grew up in your house knowing who he was, and knowing your father would never formally acknowledge him, and then your father died before he could make whatever accommodation he'd been planning, and Luca Cabretti spent the next 20 years building a position in the organization from which he could take what he decided he was owed." She closed the folder. "He's not working for Volkov. He's using Volkov. There's a difference. The interceptors tonight, they weren't meant to kill us. They were meant to destabilize, create a crisis, position himself as the decisive authority, and then when the council looks for someone to lead, he's already there," Dante said. "He's been getting there for 6 years. Dante pushed off the wall. He was moving now, the direction of a man whose stillness had just run out. "I need to—" "Don't move against him yet," she said. He stopped, turned. "He sent a message tonight," she said. "During the briefing, I saw his hand go to his jacket. Not his phone, a second device, smaller, against his chest. He sent it right after the navigation call." She met Dante's eyes. "Whatever he set in motion, it's already in motion. If you move against him now before you know what that is, you cut the wire without knowing what it's connected to." "Then what?" Dante said. His voice was controlled and cold, and she could hear, underneath that control, the particular devastation of a person betrayed by someone who grew up in the same rooms. "We let him think it's working," she said, "and we find out what's connected to the wire." Grayson Hale found the boxes at 5:40 in the morning. The storage unit in Doral smelled of dry paper and old climate control. The specific institutional smell of documents preserved, past their useful life by someone who understood that certain things should be kept but not necessarily looked at. His father had rented the unit in 1991 and paid for it through an attorney's holding account, which meant the payments had continued automatically for 33 years after his father's death, without anyone at the Hale Group ever looking directly at what they were paying for. There were 11 boxes. Grayson opened the third one because it was labeled with a year, 1989. And 1989 was the year the Hale Group's seed capital had materialized, seemingly from nothing, in the account of a newly formed Florida LLC that would eventually become the foundation of everything Grayson had built. He sat on the concrete floor in his dress shirt and his gala trousers and went through the box with a penlight and found, inside a manila envelope tucked between 2 hanging files, a set of wire transfer confirmations that had never been filed, and a handwritten note in his father's handwriting that said, simply, "V family. Agreed terms. Do not surface." V family. Grayson sat with that for a while. Kettrick was outside in the car. Florian had called back at 4:30 with nothing. The archived records were clean, which Grayson now understood meant the unclean records were here, in a climate-controlled storage unit in Doral, in a box his father had never expected anyone to open because the only person who knew about it was supposed to inherit the silence along with the fortune. He thought about Ilara. He thought about Ilara reading the divorce papers slowly, taking her full minute, signing her name in careful handwriting. He thought about the fact that she had walked away from him, from everything he'd built, everything he'd spent 8 years using her presence to legitimize. And she'd walked towards something that was apparently so much larger than anything he'd imagined that 300 of the wealthiest people in Miami had gone pale at the sight of it. He'd spent 8 years deciding she wasn't worth much. He'd spent 8 years standing on a foundation built with stolen money and calling the height impressive. He put the wire transfer confirmations in his jacket pocket. He put the handwritten note in the same pocket. He closed the box. He sat for 1 more minute on the concrete floor in the dark. Then he stood up and called Kettrick. "I need a secure line to a journalist," he said. "Not a friendly one, an unfriendly one. Someone who has been trying to get a story about the Hale Group's origins for years, and who I have specifically blocked on 3 separate occasions." A pause. "Sir, you understand what that means." "I understand what it means." He looked at the boxes. "Make the call." On the Anna, dawn was arriving as a thin gray line on the eastern horizon, and the ship had cleared the shallow channel and was running in open water again, and Luca Cabretti was standing on the port observation deck with a cup of coffee and a face assembled into the expression of a man taking the morning air. He heard her before he saw her. Not footsteps. He would have heard footsteps. Something else. The change in air pressure of someone entering a space. He developed that particular sensitivity over decades of rooms where people arrived intending harm, and it had never failed him. He turned. Alara was standing 6 feet away, hands at her sides, no coffee, no jacket over the cream sweater, looking at him with the specific quality of attention that is not confrontation and not deference, and is therefore harder to navigate than either. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "I don't sleep much," she said. "It's a new environment, takes adjustment." "I've been adjusting to new environments my whole life," she said. "I'm good at it." He looked at her, sipped his coffee. "You handled yourself well in that briefing. The channel call was correct." "I know it was." A beat. He almost smiled. "You're very direct." "I've spent a long time being indirect," she said. "I find I prefer this." She moved to the railing, not next to him, at an angle, so close enough to talk without raising voices, far enough to have space between them. She looked at the water. "You grew up in my father's house." He went very still. The stillness of someone who has been hit unexpectedly and is deciding whether to fall. "I grew up in Domenico Moretti's household," he said, careful. "That's the same thing," she said. "He was my father." "He was your father," Cabretti agreed. "How was my employer's father? There's a difference." "The financial arrangements in your file suggest otherwise." He set the coffee cup on the railing with a precision that was its own kind of violence. The controlled placement of an object by someone who wants to put their hands somewhere safe. "You've been reading my file." "Dante showed me what he had. It wasn't complete." She turned and looked at him directly. "I think you have the parts he's missing." "You're not what I expected," he said. And it came out differently from how he meant it. Not as flattery, as something rawer than that. Something that lived between acknowledgement and warning. "What did you expect?" "A symbol, a bloodline in a dress." He looked at her. "Something to point to." "I know." She held his gaze. "That's what Dante told me you'd need, something to point to so the council stays stable while you make your move." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "How long have you been planning it?" The silence was different now. The quality of it had changed. The way silence changes when 2 people stop pretending the conversation is about something other than what it's about. "I have always served this organization," he started. "Don't." Her voice was quiet and flat and left no room. "We're past that. You know I know, and you know Dante knows, and whatever you sent from that secondary phone an hour ago is already in play. So let's not." She put her forearms on the railing, looked at the gray water. "Tell me what you actually want." He looked at her profile, the stillness of her, the complete absence of performance. "Recognition," he said, finally, quietly. "What should have been acknowledged 20 years ago? By Dante. By the organization, by the council." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him yet, something under the polish, old and compound. "I spent my life building this organization's future. I bled for it. I buried people for it. And Dante will stand in front of the council next week and present a woman who has been living in Miami doing nonprofit work for a decade as the legitimate successor. And the council will accept it because of blood, because of bloodline, because that's the only currency this family has ever actually honored. He stopped. His jaw worked. I was in that house. I sat at that table. And I was never... He stopped again. The horizon was getting lighter. He was your father too, she said. Not gently, plainly. Cabretti didn't answer. He didn't acknowledge it, she said. And you've been paying for that your whole life. And somewhere along the way you decided the only way to stop paying was to take what you thought you were owed. She turned to look at him. I understand that. I understand it in a way Dante probably can't. I spent 11 years being someone I wasn't supposed to be, living a life that wasn't supposed to be mine, waiting for something I didn't have a name for. She paused. But Luca, the people you called from the Southwest, they're not your allies, they're Volkov. And Volkov doesn't care what you inherit, they care that the Moretti line ends. When they're done using you, you won't be inheriting anything. He looked at her. For a moment, one unguarded moment that a less attentive person would have missed, something in his face cracked open. The specific grief of a person who has been told a true thing they've been refusing to know. Then it closed. You're very good, he said. His voice was back to polished, back to controlled. Your father would have been proud. Don't, she said. He picked up his coffee. The ceremony is tomorrow, or it was. He looked at the horizon. You should know. I'm not the only variable in play. There are things set in motion that I can't stop at this point, even if I chose to. What things? She said. He looked at her one more time. The expression on his face was complex in a way she didn't fully have the context to read. Regret lived in it, and stubbornness, and a kind of farewell that frightened her more than open hostility would have. Get off the deck, he said quietly. Go inside. Find your brother. Luca. Go inside, Ilara. He said her name for the first time. Now. She was back inside and moving toward Dante's cabin when the first explosion hit. It came from below. Not a blast, not the concussive shock of an external strike, but the deep structural groan of something igniting in the ship's lower levels, in the engine compartment or the fuel lines, a sound that translated through steel and into her feet and up her spine as pure animal information. The ship is compromised. Find high ground. Find an exit. The lights went emergency red. The ship's internal alarm was already screaming when she reached Dante's corridor. 2 of his men were in the hall, moving fast. She pressed herself against the wall to let them pass, and then kept going and hit Dante's door without knocking, and he was already up, already dressed, already armed with a sidearm she hadn't known he carried. Engine deck, he said. Sabotage, she said, from inside. He told me something was in motion. He told me before it happened. Dante's eyes sharpened. He warned you? He told me to go inside. I think that was... She stopped. I think that was as much as he was willing to do. Dante's radio crackled. A voice, one of the ship's officers, reported fire suppression active on Deck 4, structural integrity compromised in sections C and D, and then the voice cut out and a different voice came on, a voice she didn't recognize, and what the new voice said made Dante go absolutely still. This is a message for Dante Moretti, the new voice said, in accented English, calm and broadcast ready. The Anima Nera will reach its destination, or it will reach the bottom. Your sister's recognition ceremony will not take place. The Moretti succession is concluded. Surrender navigation control in the next 10 minutes, or the second device detonates. The second device. Ilara looked at Dante. There's a second charge somewhere on this ship. Yes. And they have remote detonation. Yes. Which means they have someone on board right now with a signal device. She looked at the corridor. The layout of the ship as she'd memorized it from the schematics 3 hours ago assembled itself in her mind. Decks, corridors, communications arrays, signal range. Kill the communication systems. Jam everything. If they can't transmit the detonation signal, we lose navigation too. We go dark completely. We go dark and we have time, she said. Right now we have neither. He looked at her for 1 second, one full second where the weight of the decision sat between them. Then he keyed his radio. Communications room. Jam everything. Full spectrum. Now. The radio went static. The ship's hum changed. And somewhere in the dark below them, in one of the sections already compromised by fire and water from the suppression systems, something moved. A person, deliberate, unhurried, navigating by memory through a ship they clearly knew, and began cutting toward the surface. Marco found Cabretti at the forward emergency hatch. He wasn't running. He was standing at the hatch with his hand on the lever and his coffee still in his other hand. The same cup from the deck, she'd noticed later. Part of him had been holding on to the ordinary weight of it. And when Marco came around the corner with 3 men and a drawn weapon, Cabretti turned and looked at him with an expression that was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Marco," he said. "Don't," Marco said. "I wasn't going to." He set the coffee cup on the deck. "I was going to tell you where the second device is." Marco looked at him. "Section F," Cabretti said. "Starboard side. Behind the tertiary water tank. Magnetic mount. The detonator is radio frequency, but I had it set to a narrow band. When you jammed communications, you probably took it offline." He paused. "Probably." "Probably," Marco repeated. "I wasn't certain they'd move this fast," Cabretti said. "The interceptors last night were supposed to be a warning, not—" He stopped. "Volkov doesn't follow agreements. I know that. I knew that. He said it the way you say a thing you've known for a long time and pretended otherwise. Tell Dante—" He stopped again. "Tell him yourself," Marco said. "I don't think that's a conversation I get to have," Cabretti said. The ship groaned beneath them. Structural, deep, the voice of a damaged vessel speaking its own distress. Somewhere below, the fire suppression system was fighting for the engine room, and the outcome wasn't certain yet. "Tell him I'm sorry," Cabretti said. "Not for what I wanted, for what I used to get there." Marco's expression didn't soften, but he lowered the weapon by 2 degrees, and that was its own kind of acknowledgement. "Move," he said. "Section F, show me the device." Alara found the breach 20 minutes later. Not the device. Marco and Cabretti had reached it and confirmed the detonator offline and the charge accessible. The breach she found was different. In the ship's secondary communications array, the backup system, physically separate from the main, running on its own power cell, a terminal had been left active, not broadcasting, receiving. She sat down at it without touching the keyboard, looked at the incoming signal log, 12 messages over the past 3 hours, all from the same origin point. Encoded, but the encoding was layered over a format she half recognized from something she couldn't immediately place, a structure, a syntax, that lived in the part of her memory she'd never been able to fully explain. She looked at the origin identifier. The designation was a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to her at first pass. She looked at it again, looked at it the way she'd looked at Cabretti's file, front to back fast and then slow. The third character sequence. She'd seen it in the folder Marco had brought her last night, in the footnotes of the second file, in a table of organizational identifiers from 20 years ago. This wasn't a Volkov signal. The origin point was a Moretti internal designation, old, inactive, from before her father's death. Someone had been using a dead organizational channel to run communications through the Volkov network. Using a channel that would read as Volkov interference to anyone who didn't know the original Moretti encoding structure. Someone who had access to files from before her father's death. Someone who had grown up in the Moretti household. She sat back in the chair and understood what she was looking at, and the understanding arrived not with shock, but with the particular cold clarity of a thing that has always been true, making itself visible at last. Cabretti hadn't been running the Volkov operation. He'd been running in Sinbridet. A layer deeper, using Volkov as a screen, letting them believe they were using him while he channeled information and resources through them toward something else entirely. The question was what the something else was. The second question, the one that arrived immediately after, sharp and destabilizing, was who else in this organization was old enough to have known that channel existed. She pulled up the message log and started reading from the beginning, and by the third message her hands had gone cold, and by the 6th message she understood that the war they'd been fighting had a geometry that nobody on this ship had correctly mapped, and by the 10th message she was already standing up, already moving for the door, already building in her mind the conversation she was about to have with her brother that was going to require every ounce of composure she possessed. Because the channel wasn't Cabretti's. The channel had a user identifier attached to every message, buried in the encoding, invisible unless you knew to look. and the identifier was a name, and the name was one she knew, and the name was not Luca Cabretti. The name on the channel was Dante Moretti, and the messages were addressed, every one of them, to a contact designated only as father. And the first message in the log was dated 3 weeks before Domenico Moretti's assassination, and it read, "The arrangement is confirmed." She stood outside the secondary communications room for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds where the messages were still on the screen behind her, and the ship was groaning beneath her feet, and somewhere below Marco was holding a gun on Luca Cabretti, while a bomb disposal tech she hadn't met yet worked on a magnetic charge behind a water tank. And she was standing in a corridor with her back against cold steel and the knowledge that the man who had brought her home might be the man who had arranged to never have a home for her to return to. 4 seconds. Then she moved. Not toward Dante, not yet. She needed to be certain. Not of what she'd read, she was already certain of that, but of what she was going to do with it. Because walking into a room and detonating a truth without a plan was the kind of thing that got people killed on a ship that was already on fire. She went back to the secondary terminal and photographed every message on the screen with the small camera function on a handheld communicator she'd taken from the operations room 3 hours ago. She photographed the origin identifier. She photographed the user tag. She photographed the contact designation and the first message and the last message and the date stamps on all 12. Then she closed the terminal and thought for 30 seconds about who on this ship she could trust with what she was carrying. The answer was nobody. The answer was that she was going to have to carry it alone until she understood what it meant, which required a conversation she could not have at gunpoint in a burning ship, which meant she needed the ship to stop burning first. She went down. Section F was 3 decks below and aft, and it smelled of salt water and heat, the fire suppression foam still wet on the walls, emergency lighting turning everything amber and strange. She heard Marco's voice before she saw him, low, controlled, giving technical information to someone she didn't know, and came around the corner to find Cabretti sitting on the deck with his back against the hull, hands in his lap, unrestrained, which told her Marco had made a judgment call. The technician was working inside an access panel, hands moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who has decided that speed is the enemy right now. "Device is offline," Marco said when he saw her. "We confirmed the detonator is dead. They're disconnecting the charge now." "How long?" 10 minutes? Maybe 15? She looked at Cabretti. He looked back at her from the deck with the flat exhaustion of someone who has reached the end of a very long effort and found nothing on the other side of it. He didn't look defiant. He didn't look calculating. He looked like a man in his 50s sitting on a wet floor who was very tired. "The Volkov signal origin," she said. "The one they were using to reach you. What channel was it?" He looked at her carefully. "Why?" "Because I need to know if the channel you were using to respond was the same one they initiated contact on." A pause. Something shifted in his face. Not quite suspicion, more like the dawning of a question he hadn't thought to ask. "They initiated on a channel I'd never seen before. Old encoding. I assumed it was a legacy Volkov format." "It wasn't," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Then what was it?" "I need to confirm something first. Don't move." She looked at Marco. "Stay with him." She went back up. She found Dante on the bridge. He was at the navigation console with 2 officers, running damage assessment, his voice steady and technical, and completely at odds with the state of the ship and the state of everything she was carrying in her chest. He looked up when she came in. The expression on his face when he saw hers was the expression of someone who has been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for the thing they most dreaded. "Clear the bridge," she said. He didn't hesitate. "Give us the room." The officers moved. The door closed. She put the handheld communicator on the console between them, screen up, messages visible. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that she had time to watch his face go through several things. It wasn't performing, wasn't arranging for her benefit, and what she saw in the sequence of those things was what she needed to see. She saw recognition, not shock, not confusion. Recognition. "How long have you known?" she said. He picked up the communicator, read the first message, read the last, set it back down. "The channel existed before my father died," he said. "I know what you think those messages mean." "Tell me what they mean." "They mean that someone used my father's legacy organizational channel, a channel I had access to and monitored for years after his death. to run communications through a network that Volkov later incorporated. Whoever sent those messages was using a dead Moretti channel as a ghost identifier. It makes the messages read as originating from me. It was designed to read that way. To whom? To anyone who found them. Dante. Her voice was quiet and flat and gave nothing. I need you to understand that I'm not asking you to confess to anything. I'm asking you to tell me the truth right now in this room, because I need to know what I'm working with, and I cannot afford to be wrong about you. She held his eyes. Did you send those messages? He looked at her. The ship groaned. The emergency lighting flickered once. No, he said. Do you know who did? A pause. The pause was different from the silence of deception. She'd learned deception silences across 8 years of marriage to a man who practiced them like a craft. This was the pause of someone deciding whether to carry something alone or put it down. I have a theory, he said. Tell me. Not yet. He picked up the communicator and pocketed it. When we're not on fire. She almost said something, stopped herself. There was something in his face that wasn't evasion. It was protection, directed at something she didn't have the full picture of yet, and pushing him now would close a door she needed to keep open. Fine, she said. But Dante, those messages reference an arrangement confirmed 3 weeks before our father was killed. He looked at her steadily. I know. That means whoever sent them knew what was coming. I know that too. The ship shuddered beneath them, deep, structural, a sound like a joint giving way. And both of them grabbed the console edge, and in the amber emergency light with the sea moving under them and the ceiling groaning above, they looked at each other across the console with the specific understanding of two people who have just decided, without speaking it, to survive the next hour before they survive everything else. The engine room was not going to be saved. The chief engineer came to that conclusion at 6:47 in the morning and communicated it to Dante in the clipped, direct language of a person whose professional responsibility requires honesty over comfort. One of the two primary drives was out. The secondary was running at 40%. They had propulsion, barely, and they had steering, barely. And they had maybe 6 hours of controlled movement before the secondary gave out entirely. Where's the nearest port? Dante said. The navigation officer pulled the chart. Freeport, Bahamas. 4 hours at current speed. Get us there. Sir, Freeport is... I know what Freeport is, Dante said. Get us there. The next 4 hours were the kind that age people. Alara didn't sleep. She spent the time doing 3 things simultaneously in a way that required compartmentalization. She hadn't known she possessed until this trip. Managing the situation on board, which meant moving between the bridge and Section F and the makeshift medical station where 2 crew members were being treated for burns from the initial explosion. Constructing in her mind the geometry of the message log and what it implied about the last 30 years of Moretti organizational history, and watching Dante. Watching him the way she watched everything important, quietly, from angles that didn't appear to be watching, building a picture from fragments. What she saw was a man under extraordinary pressure who was also carrying something privately, some additional weight that he hadn't put down since she'd shown him those messages. She saw it in the way he paused before speaking to certain people, a half-second extra, a micro-assessment. She saw it in the way he looked at his phone twice and both times decided against making a call. He was protecting someone. She didn't know who yet. At 9:40 in the morning, Freeport appeared on the horizon, and at the same time her borrowed communicator buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize, routed through the ship's restored partial communications system. And the message was 3 words. It said, "Check Cabretti's coat." She stared at the message. Then she went down to Section F. Cabretti was where she'd left him, off the floor now, sitting on an equipment crate, drinking water that someone had brought him. The device had been fully removed and secured. Marco was still present, still watchful, but the energy in the room had shifted from operational emergency to something more like a waiting room. "I need your coat," she said. Cabretti looked at her. Then he stood, slowly, the way people his age move after sitting on hard surfaces, shrugged the jacket off, and held it out. She went through the pockets systematically. Exterior pockets? Nothing. Interior breast pocket. The secondary phone? Already found. Interior document pocket. Her fingers touched paper, folded, thick, the kind of paper that has been folded and unfolded many times. She pulled it out, unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten. The paper was old, cream-colored, slightly brittle at the folds, but the ink was not old. The ink was recent, weeks old at most. She read it. It took her 4 minutes, which was fast for what it contained. She read it twice. The second time her hands were not steady, but they held. The letter was from Domenico Moretti, not from 30 years ago, from 8 weeks ago. She looked up at Cabretti. "He's alive," she said. Cabretti looked at her with the tiredness of someone who has been carrying a truth for a very long time. "Yes. My father is alive." "Yes." "The assassination was staged by him, with help." He sat back down on the crate. "I've known for 6 years. I found out by accident. I was running a financial audit of legacy holdings, and I found a payment structure that shouldn't have existed, traced it to a source that shouldn't have been active, and followed it until it stopped being abstract." He looked at his hands. "He's been living outside organizational reach for 30 years. Different name, different country. He made arrangements before he disappeared. For the organization, for you, for Dante. And then he walked away from all of it." "Why?" she said. "Why would he—" "Read the second page," Cabretti said. She hadn't seen the second page. She turned the letter over. The second page was shorter, 12 lines. But the 12 lines described, in Domenico Moretti's own handwriting, an arrangement made in 1990 with the Volkov family, a deal that was supposed to protect the Moretti organization by establishing a mutually beneficial financial corridor, a deal that had gone catastrophically wrong, that had cost lives, that had put his children in danger, and that Domenico had concluded could only be resolved one way, by removing himself from the equation entirely, because the Volkov agreement had been tied to him personally, and his death, or the appearance of it, would trigger a succession crisis that would force the Volkov family to renegotiate with new leadership rather than continue pressing an advantage they'd built over years of personal leverage. He had killed himself as a strategy. He had hidden his daughter and disappeared and let his son spend 30 years grieving him and building an empire on the ruins he'd left, and it had been a calculation. Alara stood with the letter in her hands and looked at the wall. "Does Dante know?" she said. "No," Cabretti said. "That's what the messages were. I was trying to reach your father through a back channel, trying to tell him that his calculation had failed, that Volkov was pressing again, that Dante needed to know the truth before the succession ceremony or the same leverage would transfer to the next generation." He paused. "Someone else found the channel before your father did. Someone who used it to frame the communication as Dante's." "Who?" she said. Cabretti opened his mouth. The door to Section F blew inward. Not an explosion. A breach. 3 men, tactical entry, moving with the precision of a practiced team. Marco was hit first, not shot, struck, the butt of a weapon across the side of his head, fast and accurate. And he went down hard and didn't get up immediately. Alara moved on pure reflex, backward and left, putting the equipment crate between herself and the entry point, letter still in her hand. Cabretti stood up. The 3 men had weapons drawn. They weren't Dante's crew. She could tell by the cut of their gear, the insignia absence, the way they moved, which was not like the Moretti men she'd been watching for 6 hours. These men moved like contract professionals, like people who had been told a location and a target and nothing else. The one in front looked at her. "Miss Vaughn, come with us." "Who sent you?" she said. "That's not information I have." "Then you're not information I need." She looked at Cabretti. He was looking at the 3 men with an expression she couldn't fully read. Recognition, possibly, or something close to it. "You know who these men are," she said. "I know who they work for," he said. "Say it." The lead man raised his weapon. "Miss Vaughn." "Steiner," Cabretti said. "They work for a man named Steiner." The name meant nothing to her, but it clearly meant something to the lead man because his posture changed. A fractional tightening, the specific tension of someone hearing a name spoken in a room where it shouldn't have been spoken. "Cabretti," the lead man said. "Don't." "Steiner," Cabretti said again, louder. "Franz Steiner, the man who bought the Volkov family's Eastern Corridor operations in 2019. The man who has been running pressure on the Moretti organization for 3 years, not because of any historical grievance, but because he wants the Atlantic shipping routes and he needs the Moretti name to be leaderless and fractured to acquire them cheaply. He looked at Alara. The Volkov connection isn't Volkov anymore. It hasn't been for years. The Volkov family sold their debt. Steiner bought it. The lead man shot Cabretti. Not center mass. The shoulder, deliberately not lethal, and Cabretti went back into the hull and slid down it and hit the deck, and the sound he made was the compressed, involuntary sound of a man absorbing serious pain. Alara didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She looked at the three men with the weapon angles and the distances between them and the layout of the room she'd been memorizing for the past 4 hours, and she made 3 rapid calculations and acted on the third one, which was the only one that gave her a path to the door. She threw the equipment crate, not at a man, at the floor space between them, a tumbling obstacle that cost the lead man 1 full second of attention adjustment, and that second was what she needed to reach the secondary hatch in the far wall, the one that connected to the maintenance corridor she'd noted on the schematics at 4 in the morning, and she hit it at speed and it opened, and she was through it and running before the lead man's voice reached her. "Take her," he said. "Don't damage her." "Don't damage her." She ran. What? The maintenance corridor was low-ceilinged and dark, and she ran it by memory. 20 meters, left turn, ladder up, hatch, deck 3, and came up into the main corridor at a full sprint and almost hit Dante coming the other way. He caught her by both arms, looked at her face. Whatever he saw there made him look behind her immediately. "Section F," she said, breathing hard. 3 men, armed. Cabretti is down. Shot. Shoulder. He's alive. Marco is down. I don't know how badly. She gripped his forearm. "The men work for someone named Franz Steiner. Do you know that name?" Dante's face did something complicated and fast. "Where did you hear that name?" "Cabretti, before they shot him." "Steiner is—" Dante stopped. His radio was already in his hand, already keyed. He gave a location and a number and a status, and the ship's internal response was immediate. She heard doors and boots, and the organized chaos of a crew shifting from damage control to security response. "Steiner is the man I've been trying to identify for 2 years, Dante said, low and fast. "He's been behind the Volkov pressure. I didn't have a name. I had a financial signature, a pattern, but not a—" "There's more," she said. "The letter." She had it still. She looked at him. This man she'd known for less than 12 hours, her brother by blood, the person who had left her hidden and safe for 11 years and had come to collect her when the safety ran out. And she held the letter in her hand and she made a decision about trust that was not certainty, because certainty wasn't available, but was the best available approximation of it. She gave him the letter. He read it. He read it in the corridor with boots running past them and the emergency lighting still red and the ship limping toward Freeport, and she watched him read it, and she watched his face, and what she saw was not the recognition she dreaded. It was shock. Pure, structural, the kind that doesn't perform itself. When he finished the second page, he lowered the letter and looked at the opposite wall for a long moment. "He's alive," he said. "Yes." He chose— He stopped. "He chose to disappear rather than tell us. He thought it would protect us. He thought wrong." His voice was not angry. It was something older than anger, something that had been waiting 30 years to say that. He was wrong. She didn't argue with that. She wasn't sure he was incorrect. "Steiner bought the Volkov debt," she said. "He's not running a historical vendetta. He wants the shipping routes. He needs the Moretti succession to fail." "Then we don't let it fail." Dante folded the letter and put it in his jacket. "The ceremony was scheduled for after Freeport. We do it there, aboard the ship, in the harbor, with whatever council members we can reach by secure line as witnesses. Cabretti. I'll handle Cabretti." His jaw worked. He was trying to protect the organization, in his own way. "He should have come to me. He should have—" He stopped. "I'll handle it." She looked at him. "And our father?" The question sat between them. "One war at a time," Dante said. His radio crackled. One of his men reporting. 2 of the 3 intruders contained, the third unaccounted for, and the unaccounted for one had been seen heading toward the upper decks, toward the command bridge, toward the navigation controls. They moved at the same moment, in the same direction, without needing to discuss it. The upper deck was exposed to open sky, and the Bahamian morning had arrived with full force, blinding white light and warm wind and the smell of open water. And it was violently at odds with the tactical situation. The kind of morning that has no business being present at what's happening in it. The third man was on the bridge, not inside, on top of it, on the external walkway that ran along the bridge's roof, and he had a device in his hand that was not a weapon in the conventional sense. He had a transmitter. Small, flat, the kind that can push a very specific signal on a very specific frequency to a very specific receiver. Elara understood what it was before Dante did, because she'd read the device specifications in the bomb disposal report an hour ago. "The charge isn't disarmed," she said. "It's offline, there's a difference." Dante looked at the man on the walkway. The man was looking at the transmitter in his hand with the particular focus of someone who is doing math, distance, signal strength, whether the partial jamming still in effect on the ship's communications would block his frequency at this range. He decided it wouldn't. His thumb moved toward the trigger. Dante shouted something, an order in Italian, to someone behind them. And there was a shot, and the transmitter left the man's hand and skittered across the walkway railing and fell toward the sea. The man looked at his empty hand, looked at the ship, looked at Elara, specifically, with an expression she would remember afterward. Not hatred, not desperation, but the look of someone receiving information that changes the picture they were working from. The look of someone realizing that the situation is not what they were told it would be. He reached into his jacket. Second device, smaller than the first. Not a transmitter, a phone. He was going to make a call. Manual trigger, someone on the other end. He didn't need the transmitter if he could reach the right number. Elara was already moving. The walkway access ladder was 6 feet to her right, and she hit it at speed and went up it on instinct rather than decision, both hands, feet finding rungs by memory, and came over the top of the bridge roof 3 seconds after the man had the phone to his ear, and the phone was connecting, and she could hear it ringing, and she crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and hit his arm. The phone flew. He turned and grabbed her, and they went into the railing, and the railing held, and she drove her knee into his thigh. Not where she'd aimed higher, but close enough to break his grip for the half second she needed. And she got her hand on the phone where it had landed against the railing base, and she looked at the screen, connecting. She ended the call. The man hit her from behind, shoulder into her back, hard, and she went forward into the railing and felt it against her collarbone, the edge of it, the sea 40 feet below moving fast in the ship's wake, and she grabbed the rail with both hands and held. He grabbed her jacket. "The charge detonates," he said, his English accented and broken with effort. "Whether you stop me or not, Steiner has men on board you haven't found. The ship does not reach port." "How many?" she said. "Doesn't matter." "It does to me." She looked over the railing at the water. 40 feet, cold, fast-moving, she'd survive it if she had to, and the thought was abstract and remote. "How many men?" He tightened his grip on her jacket. "Tell me," she said, "and I'll make the case to Dante that you're more valuable alive." He laughed, actually laughed, a short, compressed sound that held real amusement. "You think you're in a position to— How many?" Dante's voice came from the ladder top. "Elara, step back." She didn't step back. She kept her eyes on the man holding her jacket. "Tell me." The man looked at her face. Whatever he saw in it made him make a calculation. She could see the calculation happening. The specific sequence of a person deciding whether a guarantee is worth anything. 2, he said. "Deck 2. Maintenance access, east side." She stepped back. The man let go of her jacket. Dante was on the walkway with 2 of his men, and the third man from Section F was disarmed and controlled in under 15 seconds. And Elara stood at the railing with her back to the sea and her collarbone aching where the rail had caught her and the phone still in her hand. She looked at the screen. The call she'd ended had a contact name attached to it. Not a number, a name entered in the phone's contact directory, which meant this man knew his handler personally, which meant the handler wasn't as removed from the operation as Steiner would have wanted. The contact name was Holtz. K. Holtz. She turned to Dante. "Does the name Holtz mean anything to you?" He had his own phone out, was issuing orders about Deck 2. He looked up. "Conrad Holtz?" "K. Holtz. He's one of Steiner's legal directors. He manages the corporate structure that holds the Volkov assets." Dante's eyes narrowed. If Holtz is named in that phone, then Steiner's legal director is personally running field operations, she said, which means this isn't Steiner acting through intermediaries. He's close. He's physically close to this situation. How close? Dante said. She looked at the horizon. Freeport was visible now, a dark line resolving slowly into the shapes of a harbor, a city, the geometry of civilization. 40 minutes, maybe less. Close enough, she said, that he knew our schedule, our route, our security positions, and the location of the secondary charge after Cabretti had already told us it was offline. She looked at Dante. Someone told him those things in the last 2 hours, someone with access to what's been happening on this ship. The two of them looked at each other. The morning light was merciless and white, and the ship was limping toward port on one damaged engine, and there were 2 more men on deck. 2. They hadn't reached yet, and somewhere out there, close enough to have current intelligence on their position and status, Franz Steiner was waiting to see if his investment in chaos had paid. The phone in Alara's hand buzzed. Incoming call. Same contact. K. Holtz. She looked at Dante. He looked at the phone. She answered it. Holtz, she said. A pause. Then a voice. Male, German accented, utterly composed. You're not who I expected. No, she said. I'm not. She kept her voice even, factual, giving nothing emotional. You should know. The charge is confirmed offline. Your men on deck 2 have been located, and the device your man was carrying is in my hand. She paused. You've run out of pressure. Another pause, longer this time. Miss Vaughn, Holt said, I'd like to offer you a conversation, without the current circumstances. A conversation about what? About your father, Holt said. About the arrangement he made in 1990. About the parts of that arrangement that were never in any letter. She looked at Dante. His face was unreadable. There are parts, she said, that weren't in the letter. Significant ones, Holt said. Mr. Steiner has been holding those parts for 22 years. He bought them along with the Volkov assets. And Miss Vaughn, what those parts describe changes the nature of this conversation considerably. A pause. For everyone. The ship shuddered beneath her feet. The harbor was getting closer. The morning was relentless and bright. Where? She said. Freeport, Holt said. We're already there. Freeport Harbor received the Animanera the way harbors receive damaged things, without ceremony, without judgment, simply making space. The pilot boat came out to meet them 2 miles offshore, and the harbor master's radio traffic was professional and practical, concerned with draft and berth assignment and the status of the engine situation, and nobody on the radio asked about the burn scoring on the hull or the fact that the vessel was running on one drive at reduced capacity or the armed men visible on the deck. Freeport was that kind of harbor. It had seen things. It made room. Alara stood at the bow during the approach and watched the city resolve from abstraction into detail, buildings, cranes, the geometry of a working port, and held Holtz's phone in her hand and didn't use it. He had not called back. He didn't need to. He'd said what he needed to say, and now he was waiting, which was a power position, and she understood that and didn't give him the satisfaction of filling the silence. She was thinking about her father, not the letters version of him, the strategic version, the man who had made a calculation and disappeared into it, but the earlier version, the one that existed only in second-hand accounts, and the single possible memory of a boy's hand in a dark room. She'd spent 11 years constructing a version of that man from absence, which is a thing you do when absence is all you have, and the construction had served her in certain ways and failed her in others, and now the construction was going to have to be demolished and rebuilt from materials that were apparently much more complicated than she'd been working with. She was not ready for that. She was going to do it anyway, because being ready was a luxury, and she had stopped waiting for luxuries somewhere between the divorce papers and the bomb in Section F. Marco appeared at her shoulder. He had a bandage over his left ear and a bruise across his cheekbone that was moving through its colors, and he was moving carefully in the way of someone with a headache that hasn't peaked yet, and he was carrying 2 cups of coffee. Cabretti's in surgery, he said. Ship's medic says the shoulder is manageable. He'll keep the arm. Good. She took the coffee. The 2 men on deck, too. Contained. Dante's people have them in the forward hold. They haven't said anything useful yet, but they will. He drank his coffee, winced at the movement required to lift the cup. Holtz called back. When? 20 minutes ago, to Dante's line. He's confirmed a meeting location. He looked at the harbor. Hotel Meridian, Pierside. He's booked a private dining room. Of course he has. Dante wants to know if you're coming in or if you want to stay with the ship during... I'm coming in, she said. Marco looked at her. The look had something in it she was starting to recognize as his version of concern, which was not demonstrative but was persistent. You took a hit up there on the bridge. I took a rail to the collarbone. That's a hit. I've had worse. She didn't know if that was true. It felt true, which was close enough. Marco, what do you know about Conrad Holtz? He was quiet for a moment. Corporate lawyer, restructuring specialist. He's the one who built the legal architecture that turned the Volkov criminal assets into a legitimate holding company after Steiner acquired them. He paused. He's extremely good at what he does. He's also the kind of man who doesn't make personal calls to people on damaged ships unless the information he's holding is significant enough to require it. He said Steiner has parts of my father's original arrangement, parts that weren't in the letter Cabretti had. What kind of parts? He didn't say. She looked at the harbor. They were close enough now that she could see people on the pier, the ordinary business of a working morning. That's why we're going to the meeting. The Hotel Meridian was not grand. It was the kind of place that had been grand once and had settled into a dignified middle age. Clean, functional, the woodwork good, even if the carpet was 10 years past replacement. The private dining room Holtz had booked was at the end of a corridor on the ground floor, pierside windows, and the morning light came through them in long, flat strips that made everything look slightly overexposed. Holtz was already there. He was smaller than she'd expected from the voice. Compact, 60 or so, with a careful grooming of someone who uses appearance as professional armor. He stood when they entered, which was a choice, and he did not extend his hand, which was also a choice. There were two other people in the room, a woman at the far corner of the table with a laptop and the specific posture of someone employed to be present without being acknowledged, and a man standing near the window whose face Alara didn't know, but whose build and stillness she recognized immediately as operational security. Dante came in behind Alara. Marco stayed at the door. Mr. Moretti, Holt said. Miss Vaughn. He gestured at the chairs across from him. Please. They sat. Holt sat. The room was quiet enough that the harbor sounds came through the windows. Gulls, a diesel engine idling somewhere below, the structural creak of a moored vessel. You should know, Dante said, before Holtz could begin, that two of your men are in our custody. Whatever leverage you think the operational situation on the ship gave you, the operational situation on the ship was not mine, Holtz said. A pause. Steiner's, Dante said. Mr. Steiner and I have reached a professional divergence, Holtz said. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man describing a matter of accounting. He made decisions in the last 48 hours that I was not consulted on and would not have approved. The men on your vessel, the device, that was Steiner acting unilaterally. He looked at his hands on the table. I have worked in this industry for 30 years. I have built structures that function because they are built on agreements that hold. Mr. Steiner has become someone who views agreements as provisional. So you're here to distance yourself, Alara said. I'm here to offer you what I have, Holt said, in exchange for a formal acknowledgement that my participation in the Steiner organization was administrative rather than operational, and that I cooperated fully at the point of material awareness of criminal activity. You want immunity, Dante said. I want an agreement, Holt said, which I understand is a commodity you Morettis take seriously. He reached into the laptop bag beside his chair and produced a physical drive, small, metal-cased, the kind used for secure document transfer, and placed it on the table between them. That drive, he said, contains the complete documentation of the original 1990 Moretti-Volkov arrangement, every side letter, every amendment, every communication that your father sent and received in the 6 months before he disappeared. He paused. Including the ones he sent after his supposed death. The room was very still. My father has been in contact with Steiner's organization, Dante said. It was not a question. With the Volkov organization, before Steiner acquired it. Yes. Intermittently, over 20 years. The nature of those communications. Holtz paused again, and the pause was not tactical. It was the pause of someone about to say something that required a specific kind of care. The arrangement your father made in 1990 was not a mistake. It was not a deal gone wrong. It was a deliberate structure designed by your father that gave the Volkov family significant financial access to Moretti shipping infrastructure in exchange for a guarantee of personal protection. Protection of what? Ilara said. Of himself. And of you. Holtz looked at her. The arrangement specified that in exchange for the financial access, the Volkov family would never move against the Moretti children. You specifically, Miss Vaughn, were named. The deal was built around your safety. She heard it. She heard all of it. She sat with it for the 3 seconds it took her to understand what it meant, and in those 3 seconds something happened in her chest that she didn't have immediate words for. Not grief, not anger, not relief, but some composite of all three that felt like a structural rearrangement. Her father had made a deal with the people who'd killed him, except he hadn't been killed. He'd made a deal with the Volkov family, a deal that gave them financial access they wanted, in exchange for a guarantee that his children would not be touched. And then he'd disappeared into the deal, become part of its architecture, a ghost whose survival ensured the guarantee held because a dead man's children have no one to negotiate for them, but a living one does. He hadn't abandoned them. He'd made himself into a hostage. "Where is he?" she said. Her voice came out steady. She was mildly surprised by that. "That information," Holtz said carefully, "is the part that requires the agreement to be formalized first." Dante put both hands flat on the table. "Tell me right now where Domenico Moretti is, or this conversation ends, and you navigate whatever comes next without the protection of that agreement." Holtz looked at Dante's hands on the table, looked at his face, made a calculation. "He's in Freeport," Holtz said. "He arrived yesterday. When the situation on your vessel became critical, he made contact with my office. He has been here, in this city, for the last 18 hours. The harbor sounds came through the windows, a gull, a diesel engine, the creak of something large and old in the water. "Where in Freeport?" Dante said. The address was a house 3 blocks from the harbor, in a neighborhood of modest white-painted buildings and bougainvillea gone wild over every available fence and wall. The kind of neighborhood that existed in its own time, indifferent to the industries that surrounded it. They went without Holtz. Holtz stayed in the hotel dining room with Marco and the agreement unsigned, which was its own kind of pressure, but a pressure Ilara had decided she could sustain. The house had a blue door. Dante stood in front of it for a long moment without moving. She stood beside him and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and because whatever this moment cost him was his to pay, and she was not going to diminish it by filling it with words. He knocked. The man who opened the door was 73 years old, and he was not what she expected, and she didn't know what she'd expected. He was shorter than Dante by 3 inches. His hair was white, full, worn slightly longer than fashionable. His face was deeply lined in the way of someone who has lived in equatorial light for decades. His eyes were the eyes she'd seen in one photograph and half remembered from a possible memory, and they were looking at her now with an expression that she was not going to be able to describe to anyone who asked her about this moment. He said her name. Just her name. The one he'd given her, not the one she'd carried. She didn't answer immediately. She stood on his doorstep in Freeport, the Bahamian morning enormous and white around her, and she looked at the man who had made himself into a ghost to keep her safe, and had been a ghost for 30 years, and had watched from a ghost's distance while she grew up, and married wrong, and stood in the rain at a gala being discarded by a man who had no idea what he was discarding. "You could have told us," she said. "Yes," he said. "You chose not to." "I chose to keep you alive." He said it without defense. "I have had 30 years to find better reasoning, and I haven't found any." "We thought you were dead." "I know." "Dante built everything." She stopped, looked at Dante. Dante was looking at their father with an expression she understood completely, because she'd seen it on her own face at 5 in the morning in a ship's mirror, and she recognized it now. The expression of a person who has been carrying the wrong grief for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down, but doesn't yet know what putting it down will feel like. "Come in," Domenico Moretti said. He stepped back from the door. "Please." They stayed for 3 hours. She would not remember all of it later. Not because she was inattentive, but because some things are too large to hold in memory at full resolution, and the mind does its own editing in the days after, preserving the weight while releasing some of the specificity. She would remember the kitchen, which was small and smelled of coffee and old wood. She would remember Dante sitting across from their father and not speaking for the first 20 minutes, just sitting while their father spoke, and Dante listened, and she watched them both with the specific attention of someone who is witnessing something that required 30 years to arrive at this table. She would remember the documents Domenico had kept, his own copies, everything Holtz had on that drive, and more. Communications, financial records, the specific architecture of the 1990 arrangement laid out in handwriting and early-era printouts. He had kept all of it. 30 years of a life lived in careful documentation, as if he'd always known the accounting would eventually be required. She would remember asking him about Grayson. Not in any elaborate way. She'd mentioned the name, the gala, the divorce papers on the silver tray, and he'd listened without expression and then said quietly, "I know who he is." And when she'd looked at him, he'd said, "I've kept track of your life, as much as I could, from a distance." And she'd understood that the distance was not indifference, and she'd accepted that understanding without being able to feel entirely clean about it yet. She would remember the moment Dante finally spoke. He'd been quiet for a long time, and then he'd said without preamble, "The organization is going legitimate. The succession ceremony happens today. Alara leads the transition to a legal structure. All of it. The ports, the shipping contracts, the security networks. Legitimate." He'd paused. "That's what this cost, and those are the terms." Their father had looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," Domenico had said, simply, as if he'd been waiting for that specific answer for 30 years. They did the ceremony on the ship. The Anima Nera was berthed in Freeport Harbor by early afternoon, and the burn scoring on the hull and the missing secondary drive and the foam-dried corridors were all still present and visible, and nobody cleaned any of it up before the ceremony, which was Alara's decision, and which she didn't explain to anyone. She stood on the main deck in the afternoon light, in the same cream sweater from the night before. Nobody had offered her a formal alternative, and she hadn't asked for one. And Marco read the recognition language from a document their father had written 30 years ago and preserved against this moment. And the 4 council members Dante had reached by secure line witnessed remotely from screens set up on the navigation console brought out to the deck. Cabretti was present. He'd insisted on it, and the medic had cleared him to be moved with conditions, and he sat in a deck chair with his shoulder bandaged and his arm in a temporary sling. And when the recognition was read, he didn't look away. He looked at her directly. She looked back at him directly. After the formal language was done, and the council members had given their remote attestations, Cabretti raised his good hand, just slightly, just enough, and she gave him a nod in return that meant several things she didn't need to enumerate. He was not forgiven for everything. She was not sure forgiveness was the right frame, but he had told the truth in Section F with a bullet in his shoulder, and that counted for something, and she was going to let it count. Their father stood at the edge of the deck, slightly removed, in a pale shirt with the collar open, watching. When the ceremony finished, he didn't approach. He waited. She crossed the deck to him. "You understand what this means for the arrangement," she said. "The Volkov guarantee, Steiner's leverage. It's all built on the criminal structure. If we go legitimate, the financial access disappears. Whatever deal you made is over," he said. "Yes. You'll be exposed." "I've been exposed since Cabretti started pulling threads." He looked at the harbor. "I've had 30 years of a life that wasn't mine. I think I can manage exposure." She looked at the side of his face, the lines of it, the age. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "This?" She gestured between them, not elegantly. "I don't know what this is supposed to look like." "Neither do I," he said. "I haven't done it before either. You had 30 years to think about it. Thinking about something and knowing how to do it are different things." He looked at her. "I've had 30 years of theory. You have the only evidence available about what you actually need from a person in my position." She looked at him for a long moment. "I need time," she said. "I have time," he said. "I have a great deal of it." Grayson Hale's broadcast went live at 6 o'clock that evening. She watched it on a borrowed tablet in the harborside room Dante had arranged for her, sitting on the edge of a bed that wasn't hers. in a city she hadn't planned to be in, 30 hours into what had been the most consequential day of her life. The journalist he'd found was not a friendly one. The broadcast was not gentle. Grayson sat in front of a camera in what appeared to be a law office, neutral, anonymous, and he read from documents and answered questions and did not hedge and did not deflect and said, repeatedly, in different words, that he had inherited corruption without knowing it and had benefited from it without questioning it, and that the questioning, when it came, was overdue. The wire transfers, the Volkov connection, the Hale Group's founding capital, all of it. He looked exhausted. He looked like someone who had been awake for 36 hours making a decision and had reached the decision and was now living in the part that comes after. She turned the tablet off. She sat with the screen dark for a while, thinking about the man she'd married at 26 because he'd seemed like the most concrete thing available at a time when she'd needed something to hold on to. Thinking about the 8 years of becoming less, the daily surrenders, the versions of herself she'd folded up and stored. Thinking about what it meant that the man who'd signed divorce papers on a silver tray had in the end done the only thing she could genuinely respect him for. She didn't feel warmth about it. She didn't feel contempt either. She felt the particular coolness of someone who has moved past a landscape and can see it clearly now, precisely because she is no longer in it. Steiner was arrested 2 days later. Not by Moretti Resources, by Bahamian authorities working on financial crime referrals from 3 separate jurisdictions, referrals that had been filed, with exquisite timing, by Holtz's attorney within hours of their Freeport meeting. Holtz had been thorough. The evidence package was extensive. The charges included fraud, criminal conspiracy, and coordination of violence on the high seas, which was a specific legal category that carried significant consequence. Elara learned about the arrest from Marco, who delivered the information with the same tone he used for all information, factual, unembellished, leaving her room to respond however she needed to. She said, "Good," and meant it without satisfaction, which was its own kind of closure. The Volkov network, deprived of Steiner's financial management and facing the collapse of the legal architecture Holtz had built, fractured along the lines all criminal organizations fracture along when the money stops, quickly, noisily, and with a great deal of people pointing at each other. The specific leverage they'd held over the Moretti organization, the 30-year arrangement, the financial access, the threat of exposure, dissolved because the Moretti organization had beaten them to the exposure. You cannot threaten a fire with burning. The paperwork to convert the Moretti Syndicate's holdings into a legitimate international shipping and security corporation took considerably longer than any single dramatic confrontation. It took months. It involved attorneys in 7 jurisdictions, regulatory filings in 4 countries, and negotiations with port authorities who were deeply skeptical and required sustained evidence of organizational commitment before they'd grant the licenses required to operate legally in their waters. Elara did most of it. Not because Dante couldn't, he was capable and present and committed to the transition in a way that surprised people who'd built their understanding of him on 30 years of different evidence. She did most of it because she was better at it, and they both knew it, and the knowledge sat between them without friction, which was something she hadn't expected. She'd grown up in nonprofit administration. She'd spent 10 years learning how legitimate organizations moved, how boards functioned, how regulatory relationships were built and sustained. She'd spent 10 years acquiring skills that Grayson had considered decorative and that turned out to be exactly what the next chapter required. She thought about that sometimes. The way life deposits things in you that you can't see the use of until suddenly you can. She set up an office in the Ana Manera's restructured administrative deck, which she'd had refitted during the dry dock repairs that followed Freeport, because the ship was the organization's physical heart, and she saw no reason to move that heart to land simply because the nature of its beating had changed. The burn marks on the hull were repaired. The secondary drive was replaced. The foam in Section F was cleaned and the space was returned to its function. Marco remained. He ran ship security with the same careful attentiveness he'd applied to 11 years of watching over a woman in Coral Gables. And the transition to legal operations required that attentiveness and his particular institutional knowledge in equal measure. Cabretti left. Not under any formal censure, it was a mutual recognition, arrived at over a conversation that lasted 2 hours and left both of them with the specific exhaustion of people who have said true things. He took a settlement, a clean severance from the organization, and a document signed by Dante that acknowledged his decades of service without attributing malice to his choices. He went somewhere she didn't know, because she didn't ask, because his next chapter was not her chapter to follow. She thought he would be fine. She thought fine was a complicated word, and that he had earned his version of it. Grayson lost the Hale Group. The financial investigations that followed his broadcast unraveled the founding capital structure, and the subsequent legal proceedings were lengthy and unfriendly and resulted in a settlement that left him significantly solvent but stripped of the primary brand and most of the real estate portfolio he'd spent his adult life constructing. He didn't contest much of it. His attorney, a new one, a public-facing one, not Florian, said in a statement that his client accepted responsibility and was committed to the restitution process. She didn't follow it closely. She had enough of her own accounting to manage. He sent her one message, 6 weeks after Freeport, through an attorney. It was 2 sentences. It said, "I understand now why you read those papers slowly. I should have been paying attention a long time before that." She read it once. She didn't reply. She set it aside in the part of herself where she kept things that were true and finished and no longer required action. She and Dante found their way to each other slowly, the way people find their way to things that matter. Not through grand gestures, but through accumulated time. Through the daily ordinary fact of working in the same organization, disagreeing about approaches, eating meals in the same galley, learning each other's habits of mind. He was stubborn in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was more methodical than he'd expected. Both of these things created friction, and both of these things, eventually, made the structure between them more load-bearing. Their father came to Miami. He came 4 months after Freeport, at her invitation, which she extended only after she'd had enough time to know what the invitation meant and what she expected from it. He stayed for a week in an apartment Dante arranged, and she saw him 3 times during the week, once for dinner with Dante, once alone, once at the Moretti Corporation's new Miami offices, where she showed him the regulatory filings and the Port Authority agreements and the first quarterly report of an organization operating in the light. He looked at the quarterly report for a long time. "Your mother would have liked this," he said. "Tell me about her," she said. He did. For 2 hours, over bad coffee from the office machine, he told her about her mother, and she listened the way she listened to everything important, completely, without interrupting, building the picture. It wasn't enough. It would not be enough for a long time. There was no version of enough that this situation could straightforwardly provide. And she had made her peace with that. Not the easy peace of someone who has stopped caring, but the harder peace of someone who has decided to build a present that doesn't require the past to have been different. He left after a week. He returned 3 months later. The intervals decreased. She did not call him father yet. She thought she would, eventually. She thought eventually was okay. The morning she remembered best came 6 months after Freeport. The Anamanera was in open water off the Florida coast, running a legitimate cargo route between Miami and Nassau, carrying nothing more dramatic than industrial equipment and the paperwork to prove it. It was early, 6 in the morning, the sky doing the particular thing it does in October off the Atlantic, going through colors that have no names in any language she'd learned. She stood at the bow in a jacket that fit and shoes that were wrong for a deck but comfortable, and she had coffee in her hand, and she was not thinking about anything in particular. She was just standing in the morning on a ship that was hers in every sense that mattered, with the horizon doing what horizons do, offering nothing specific and everything possible. Marco came up beside her. He didn't say anything. He stood there with his own coffee and looked at the water. "I've been thinking," she said after a while. "I know," he said. "The channel," she said, "the secondary communications channel Cabretti was using. Someone built that channel to look like it was Dante's. Someone with access to old organizational identifiers who knew it would hold up to a basic review." She drank her coffee. "It wasn't Cabretti." "No," Marco said. "Holtz's organization built it. Steiner's people. They found the old channel structure in the Volkov documentation and reverse-engineered an identifier that would read as Dante's." "Yes." "Which means, when I found those messages and thought Dante had sent them," she paused, "that was the intended outcome. That was the point. If I'd confronted him differently, if I'd gone to him with suspicion instead of the question I actually asked, you would have handed Steiner the fracture he needed," Marco said, "between you and Dante. Instead, I asked him directly," she said, "and the way he answered, I saw that he didn't know. She paused. I was lucky. You were paying attention, Marco said. She considered that. The distinction between luck and attention was one she was still working out, and she thought she'd be working it out for some time. That morning on the deck, she said, when Cabretti told me to go inside. Yes. He was trying to protect me. In his way. In a very indirect and costly and complicated way. Marco said. He's that kind of person. He drank his coffee. Most people are, when you get to the real thing underneath. She thought about that. She thought about a man who had grown up in a house where he was never acknowledged and had spent his whole life trying to claim what he believed he was owed, and who, at the moment of maximum crisis, had done the thing that cost him the most and yielded him the least. She thought about Grayson reading divorce papers onto a silver tray, and 6 weeks later sitting in front of a camera and saying, I should have been paying attention. She thought about her father in a kitchen in Freeport saying, I haven't done this before either. She thought about all the ways people contain their worst choices and their best ones simultaneously, in the same body, in the same life, and how the accounting of a person was never as simple as the worst thing or the best thing, but always the composite, always the whole difficult register. The sun was up fully now. The water was going gold. The ship moved beneath her feet with the specific steadiness of a vessel that had been repaired correctly, that had been given what it needed, that was now carrying its weight the way it was designed to. Not perfectly, not without the history of what it had survived showing in its structure, but forward, and reliably, and in the light. She finished her coffee. She had a 9 o'clock call with the Nassau Port Authority, and a 2 o'clock review of the second quarter financial projections, and a conversation she'd scheduled with Dante about expanding the legitimate security contracts to 3 additional regional governments who'd expressed interest. She had work to do. She turned from the horizon and walked back across the deck, and the morning opened around her, and she was not rescued and not returned and not transformed into anything she hadn't always been, underneath everything that had been piled on top of her. She was simply, at last, exactly where she was supposed to be. And that was enough. That was, it turned out, more than enough.